In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a paradox so fundamental that to speak it aloud borders on heresy. Yet whisper it we must, for in understanding this contradiction lies the terrible truth of what it means to live under the Imperium's endless shadow. Every soul born within the Emperor's domain belongs not to themselves, but to him. From the moment of first breath to the final rattle of death, each life is property of the state, a resource to be catalogued, processed, and ultimately expended in service to humanity's survival. The paradox is this: refusal is impossible, yet refusal always happens. In a galaxy where 10,000 worlds burn with eternal war, where humanity clings to existence by the thinnest of threads, where every man, woman, and child is already forfeit to the Emperor's will, there are still those who say no. They whisper it in the darkness of underhive tunnels. They scream it as the Arbites drag them from their families. They carve it into their own flesh rather than accept the mark of conscription. But what becomes of those who deny the call? What fate awaits the soul foolish enough to believe that they might choose their own path in a universe that has already chosen for them? The question itself is dangerous, for to ask it is to acknowledge that choice might exist at all. In the Imperium of Man, choice is the greatest luxury, and luxuries are reserved for the dead. The Emperor protects, so the saying goes, but protection comes at a cost measured in blood and bone, in the screams of the faithful and the silence of the lost. Every world must pay its tithe, every family must offer its children, every heart must break so that the species might endure another day. This is the burden of existence in the 41st millennium, where survival is not a right but a privilege earned through sacrifice. Yet still, in the darkest corners of the human heart, rebellion stirs. It is not the grand rebellion of chaos, nor the calculated treachery of the heretic. It is something far more human and therefore far more dangerous: the simple, desperate desire to live one's own life, to love one's own family, to die one's own death. In the Imperium, such desires are not merely selfish, they are abomination. To understand what happens to those who refuse the Emperor's call, one must first understand the machinery that makes such refusal both inevitable and impossible. One must comprehend the vast, grinding engine of bureaucracy that turns human beings into numbers, families into statistics, worlds into quotas. One must witness the cold precision with which the Imperium harvests its own children, and the terrible efficiency with which it punishes those who dare to hide in the shadows. The story that unfolds is not one of heroes or villains, for in the grim darkness of the far future, such distinctions have long since lost their meaning. It is instead a meditation on the mathematics of despair, the arithmetic of oppression, the simple equation that governs all life in the Emperor's domain: submit or be destroyed. There are no other options, no middle path, no mercy for those who would choose differently. So we begin not with hope, but with its absence. Not with the promise of redemption, but with the certainty of damnation. In the Imperium of Man, every story ends the same way: in service, in death, in the cold comfort of duty fulfilled. The only question is how much suffering must be endured before the inevitable conclusion is reached. The tithe begins before dawn, as all things do in the Imperium. In the grey half-light that passes for morning on Hive World Mortalis Prime, the great machines of conscription wheeze to life with the mechanical inevitability of a corpse drawing breath. Somewhere in the administrative sectors, buried beneath kilometers of hab blocks and industrial waste, the servitors begin their daily ritual of cataloguing humanity. Names are inked in ledgers older than some worlds, their yellowed pages crackling with the weight of 1,000,000 lives reduced to entries in a vast accounting of flesh. Each stroke of the quill is a verdict rendered, each number a future stolen, each quota a community condemned. The scribes who perform this work are pale, watery-eyed creatures who have spent so long counting the living that they have forgotten what life looks like. Their fingers are stained black with ink and duty, their souls bleached white with the terrible mathematics they serve. This year, Mortalis Prime owes the Imperium 43,712 souls. The number has been calculated with obsessive precision by the Departamento Munitorum, factored against population density, industrial output, and the mysterious variables known only to the Emperor's most trusted servants. It is not a request. It is not a suggestion. It is a debt written in blood and paid in bone, as inevitable as the turning of the worlds and as merciless as the void between the stars. The process is not noble. There are no stirring speeches about duty and honor, no grand ceremonies to mark the transition from citizen to soldier. Instead, there is only the grinding mundanity of bureaucracy, the suffocating weight of paperwork, the casual efficiency with which human beings are sorted, processed, and prepared for shipment like any other resource. The Imperium does not see heroes when it looks upon its subjects. It sees units of production, calories of energy, acceptable losses in a war that spans the galaxy. In the processing centers, bodies are counted like cattle. Men and women stand in endless lines that snake through corridors filled with the acrid stench of disinfectant and despair. They are measured, weighed, categorized according to their potential value to the war machine. The strong are marked for the guard, their broad shoulders and steady hands promising years of service before the inevitable bullet or blade finds them. The weak are processed for other duties, labor gangs, servitor conversion, or the countless support roles that keep the Imperium's vast machinery turning. The selection process is performed by men and women whose humanity has been carefully excised through decades of service. They look upon each conscript not as a person with hopes and fears, but as a problem to be solved, a resource to be allocated. A young woman weeps as she is separated from her children. The selector notes her emotional instability in his ledger. An old man pleads that he is too frail for service. He is marked for processing into a servitor, his experience deemed more valuable than his autonomy. The families that remain are given small metal tokens, tarnished discs bearing the Imperial Aquila and a registration number. These are meant to serve as memorial tokens, should the conscripted ever fall in service to the Emperor. Most families know better than to expect them back. The tokens join collections of similar discs in small shrines throughout the Hive, monuments to sons and daughters who disappeared into the vast maw of Imperial service and were never seen again. In the depths of the administrative sectors, the great engines of calculation continue their work. Fresh requisitions arrive daily from 100 different war zones, each demanding its tribute of flesh and blood. The Sabbat worlds need infantry to hold the line against chaos incursions. The Damocles Gulf requires specialists to fight the expanding Tau Empire. The Tyrannid Hive fleets consume entire systems, their advance measured not in kilometers but in the millions of lives required to slow their progress. Each demand is processed, calculated, distributed among the Imperium's countless worlds according to algorithms so complex that they border on the mystical. Entire populations are reduced to variables in equations that stretch across light years and span centuries. The human cost is not ignored. It is simply irrelevant compared to the greater mathematics of survival. The quotas are filled with methodical precision. Districts are selected according to population density and production value. The most productive areas are harvested lightly, their industrial capacity too valuable to disrupt. The poorest sectors are strip-mined of every able body, their populations reduced to skeletal crews barely capable of maintaining basic infrastructure. It is a careful balance between immediate need and long-term sustainability, the product of 10 millennia of experience in the harvesting of humanity. By week's end, 43,712 souls have been collected, processed, and prepared for transport to staging areas throughout the sector. They will be loaded onto transport ships like cargo, their names already forgotten by the system that claimed them. Some will die in transit, victims of warp storms or mechanical failure. Others will perish in the training camps, their bodies too weak to survive the brutal regimen that transforms civilians into soldiers. The survivors will be shipped to war zones across the galaxy, where they will serve until death claims them or madness makes service impossible. The ledgers are closed, the quotas marked complete, the great machinery of conscription powered down until the next tithe cycle begins. In the administrative sectors, the scribes return to their other duties, filing reports and processing requisitions with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to the harvesting of lives. For them, it is simply another day in service to the Emperor, another page filled in the endless book of human sacrifice that keeps the Imperium alive. The bureaucracy of enlistment is a thing of terrible beauty, a vast organism of parchment and procedure that has evolved over 10,000 years into the perfect instrument of human processing. It operates with the precision of a chronometer and the inexorability of death itself, transforming free citizens into imperial property with nothing more than the stroke of a quill and the press of a seal. The process begins in the census halls, cathedral-like structures where the populations of entire continents are reduced to entries in massive tomes. Here, scribes bent with age and purpose maintain the great records of humanity, tracking births and deaths, marriages and divorces, the endless ebb and flow of imperial citizenry. Every name is recorded, every life catalogued, every soul accounted for in the Emperor's vast ledger of the living. When the call comes, and it always comes, the machinery springs into motion with practiced efficiency. The Departamento Munitorum's requirements are transmitted through astropathic choir to sector command, where they are broken down by world, by continent, by hive, by district, until finally they reach the local administration centers as specific quotas to be filled. The numbers are precise, calculated to the last soul: 347 infantry, 12 specialists, 26 support personnel, 5 potential officer candidates. The selection algorithms are marvels of administrative engineering, factoring age, health, family status, industrial value, and a dozen other variables into equations that determine who lives and who dies with mathematical certainty. Families with multiple children are harvested more heavily, their genetic investment in the future balanced against their immediate value to the war effort. Skilled workers receive temporary exemptions, their expertise too valuable to waste on the front lines, though even they know their time will come when younger hands can be trained to replace them. Entire towns find themselves stripped bare in the course of a single day. The administratum arrives with their ledgers and their lists, calling names with the same tone one might use to order supplies from a warehouse. Johannes Krell, age 19, suitable for infantry. Maria Santos, age 22, qualified for Vox operations. Dmitry Volkov, age 17, acceptable for penal legion service due to minor infractions recorded in his youth. Each name is a thread pulled from the fabric of community, each conscription a small death that leaves families and neighborhoods forever changed. The families left behind discover that their obligations to the state have only begun. The Imperium's appetite for sacrifice extends beyond the simple harvesting of bodies. It demands the complete submission of those who remain. Parents are required to sign documents acknowledging their children's service, formally transferring ownership from family to state. Spouses must surrender marriage certificates, dissolving unions that might otherwise interfere with military discipline. Even children are processed, their futures mortgaged against their parents' service to ensure continued compliance. The paperwork is overwhelming in its scope and suffocating in its detail. Forms must be filed in triplicate, each copy stamped with seals of increasing importance as they make their way up the administrative hierarchy. Conscription documents, transfer orders, loyalty oaths, genetic records, psychological profiles. The bureaucracy feeds on documentation with an insatiable hunger, producing mountains of parchment that document every aspect of the human harvest. Scribes labor in vast halls filled with the scratch of quills and the rustle of paper, their pale faces illuminated by flickering lumens as they process the endless stream of human transformation. They work in shifts around the clock, their replacements taking up interrupted sentences without missing a syllable, the great work of cataloging humanity continuing without pause or rest. Many of these scribes have never seen the outside of their administrative sectors, their lives consumed entirely by the mechanical rhythm of bureaucracy. In the deeper levels of the administrative complexes, the truly ancient machinery of obligation reveals itself. Here, servitors tend to cogitate as older than entire civilizations, their mechanical brains processing data streams that stretch back to the founding of the Imperium itself. Every conscription is cross-referenced against genetic databases, loyalty indexes, productivity matrices, and 1,000 other variables that determine not just who serves, but how they serve, where they serve, and how long they are expected to survive. The families hiding their children discover that concealment requires more than simply staying out of sight. The bureaucracy has evolved sophisticated methods for detecting evasion, from genetic sampling that can identify family lines to economic analysis that reveals suspicious patterns of resource consumption. A family that suddenly begins purchasing food for fewer mouths triggers automated investigation protocols. A parent whose productivity drops due to grief over a hidden child finds themselves subjected to enhanced scrutiny. Entire districts are locked down when discrepancies are discovered in the census data. Arbeit squads move through hab blocks with grim efficiency, their scanner arrays detecting heartbeats, breath patterns, even the electromagnetic signatures of human nervous systems. They are accompanied by scribes carrying portable cogitators, the better to process any discoveries in real time and maintain the perfect accuracy of imperial records. The system's reach extends even to those who attempt to flee beyond the boundaries of their assigned districts. The Imperium's transportation networks are monitored with obsessive precision, every movement tracked and recorded in databases that span star systems. A citizen attempting to relocate without proper authorization finds their identity markers flagged across multiple worlds, their biometric data transmitted to enforcement agencies throughout the sector. Perhaps most insidious of all is the machinery of social obligation that the bureaucracy has constructed around the conscription process. Families are encouraged, required, to participate in ceremonies celebrating their sacrifice to the emperor. Communities are made to witness the departure of their young people, their grief transformed into public displays of loyalty. Those who mourn too openly find themselves marked for additional scrutiny, their emotional responses catalogued as potential indicators of seditious thinking. The bureaucracy of enlistment is more than simply an administrative process. It is a form of spiritual colonization, transforming the very concept of family and community into extensions of state power. Under its influence, parents learn to view their children not as their own flesh and blood, but as resources belonging to the emperor, temporarily entrusted to their care until the state requires their return. The first cracks in the perfect machinery of obligation appear not as dramatic explosions of rebellion, but as tiny fissures of absence. A name called in the morning muster that receives no response. An empty bunk in a conscription facility. A family that claims ignorance of their child's whereabouts when the scribes come calling with their ledgers and their seals. At first, these absences are explained away as administrative errors, the inevitable result of managing populations that number in the billions. Clerical mistakes happen, after all, even in the perfect bureaucracy of the emperor's domain. A name might be misspelled, an address incorrectly recorded, a citizen temporarily relocated for work obligations. The system is vast enough to accommodate such minor irregularities, confident in its ability to eventually locate and process every soul within its domain. But the whispers begin almost immediately, spreading through the population centers like smoke through ventilation systems. Invisible, pervasive, impossible to fully contain. In the workers' cantinas, voices drop to conspiratorial murmurs as stories circulate of individuals who simply vanished when their names were called for service. Some fled into the underhives, it is said, disappearing into the vast networks of tunnels and forgotten spaces that exist beneath every major population center. Others allegedly bribed petty officials, their names mysteriously disappearing from conscription lists in exchange for thrown gelt or favors. The most disturbing rumors speak of those who simply did not show up, citizens who received their conscription orders, acknowledged them, and then failed to report for processing. These stories are told in hushed tones, as if speaking them too loudly might somehow make them true, or worse, might draw the attention of those whose job it is to ensure such things do not happen. In the depths of Hive Mortalis, where the Emperor's light penetrates only as regulation and obligation, entire communities begin to organize around the unthinkable. Families pool resources to hide their children in abandoned sectors, creating hidden networks of supply and communication that operate parallel to the official systems of imperial control. These are not grand gestures of rebellion, they are small, desperate attempts at preservation, parents trying to save their children from a system that views them as nothing more than raw material for the war machine. The methods of evasion are as varied as they are dangerous. Some families arrange false documentation, attempting to age their children out of conscription range or classify them as medically unfit for service. Others relocate their offspring to distant relatives on far-flung worlds, hoping that bureaucratic inefficiency will protect what parental love cannot. The most desperate resort to physical alteration, deliberate injuries that might disqualify a child from military service, or surgical modifications that obscure genetic markers used in imperial identification systems. Underground markets develop around the tools of evasion. Forged documents change hands in shadowy exchanges, their creators risking summary execution for the crime of undermining imperial conscription. Medical practitioners offer off-the-books procedures designed to simulate disqualifying conditions, their oath to preserve life twisted into a form of resistance against a system that demands its destruction. Information brokers sell details about conscription schedules and enforcement patterns, allowing families precious hours or days to hide their children before the collectors arrive. The whispers carry not just information, but a more dangerous cargo, the idea that refusal might be possible. In a society built on absolute submission to imperial will, the mere suggestion that choice might exist is a form of ideological contamination. Citizens who have never questioned their obligations to the state begin to wonder, for the first time in their lives, whether those obligations are truly absolute. Parents who have watched their neighbors' children disappear into the maw of military service start to ask themselves whether their own families must suffer the same fate. The language of resistance is necessarily subtle, disguised in euphemisms and coded phrases that might pass casual scrutiny by imperial authorities. Families speak of extended visits rather than flight, of medical complications rather than deliberate injury, of administrative delays rather than active evasion. These linguistic camouflages serve a dual purpose. They provide plausible deniability for those who use them, while also creating a shared vocabulary of rebellion that bonds communities together in their opposition to the system. Religious justifications begin to emerge for these acts of defiance, as desperate parents seek spiritual validation for their resistance to imperial authority. Fringe interpretations of imperial doctrine surface, suggesting that the emperor's true will lies not in blind obedience to earthly authorities, but in the preservation of human life and family bonds. These theological arguments are whispered in private gatherings, their proponents careful to avoid the attention of the ecclesiarchy's enforcers, who view any deviation from orthodox doctrine as potential heresy. The most dangerous whispers are those that speak of success, stories of families who managed to hide their children, of individuals who escaped conscription and lived to tell the tale. These accounts, whether true or fabricated, serve as beacons of hope in a society that has been systematically drained of such luxuries. They suggest that the system, for all its terrible efficiency, might not be entirely perfect, that cracks might exist in the armor of imperial authority. Yet even as these whispers spread, they carry with them the seeds of their own destruction. The same networks that allow information about evasion to circulate also create vulnerabilities that imperial authorities can exploit. Trust becomes a luxury that few can afford, as the line between ally and informant blurs in the grey moral landscape of survival under totalitarian rule. The whispers of refusal are like smoke in the lungs. Once inhaled, they cannot be fully exhaled. They linger in the consciousness of the population, a constant reminder that alternatives to submission might exist, however dangerous or futile they might ultimately prove to be. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even the possibility of choice is a form of rebellion against the natural order of imperial existence. To understand why a soul might refuse the Emperor's call, one must first acknowledge that such understanding is itself a form of heresy. The imperial doctrine is clear: service is not just duty, it is the highest expression of human purpose, the transformation of base flesh into an instrument of the Emperor's will. To question this transformation is to question the very foundations of human civilization, yet question it they do, these misguided souls who place personal desire above species survival. Fear drives many of them, the simple, animal terror of death on alien battlefields where human life is measured not in years but in minutes. They have heard the stories whispered in the darkness, accounts of guard regiments hurled against tyrannid bioforms in desperate last stands, of soldiers ordered to march across killing fields swept by Tau pulse fire, of men and women consumed by warp storms when their ships are lost in transit between the stars. The galaxy is vast and filled with horrors beyond human comprehension, and somewhere in the depths of their souls, they believe that hiding might postpone their appointment with these terrors. Others are motivated by love, an emotion that the Imperium tolerates in small doses but views with suspicion when it grows strong enough to challenge state authority. A mother who refuses to surrender her son sees only the child she raised from birth, not the raw material for military service that the system demands. A father who hides his daughter considers only her happiness and safety, not the greater good of humanity that her sacrifice might serve. These bonds of affection become chains of sedition, binding families together in opposition to their obligations to the species. Some are driven by hatred, not the clean hatred of humanity's enemies that the Imperium encourages, but the bitter resentment of subjects toward their own government. They have watched the Imperium's endless wars consume generation after generation with no apparent progress toward victory, have seen their world stripped bare to feed a war machine that seems incapable of achieving anything more than perpetual stalemate. Their rebellion is not against humanity, but against the system that claims to protect humanity while devouring it from within. The most dangerous are those motivated by hope, individuals who believe that alternatives to the current system might be possible, that humanity might find ways to survive that do not require the constant sacrifice of its children. These dreamers imagine futures where war is not eternal, where families need not be torn apart for the sake of military necessity, where individual lives might have value beyond their utility to the state. Such optimism is perhaps the greatest heresy of all, for it suggests that the Emperor's vision might be flawed. Yet for all the variety in their motivations, these would-be draft dodgers share a fundamental misunderstanding of their place in the cosmic order. They see themselves as individuals with rights and choices, when in truth they are cells in the vast organism of humanity, valuable only insofar as they contribute to the survival of the whole. Their refusal to serve is not merely selfish, it is a form of spiritual amputation, a rejection of the biological imperative that binds all humans together in common cause against extinction. The system recognizes this misunderstanding and responds to it not with anger but with the cold precision of medical intervention. Cowardice, in the imperial view, is not a moral failing but a psychological disorder, a malfunction in the mental processes that should naturally lead to acceptance of sacrifice for the greater good. Like any disorder, it requires treatment, not gentle therapy or patient education, but the harsh corrective measures necessary to restore proper function to damaged human material. The contagious nature of cowardice makes it particularly dangerous to the social order. A single individual's refusal to serve might inspire others to similar acts of defiance, creating cascading failures in the conscription system that could ultimately threaten humanity's ability to defend itself. The mathematics are stark. If even a small percentage of citizens successfully evade military service, the resulting shortfall in manpower could translate into lost battles, fallen worlds, entire sectors consumed by humanity's enemies. This is why the system cannot afford to treat draft dodging as mere personal weakness or individual moral failure. Each act of evasion represents a potential breakdown in the social conditioning that keeps imperial society functioning, a crack in the foundation upon which 10,000 years of human survival has been built. The response must therefore be proportional not to the immediate harm caused by a single missing soldier, but to the existential threat posed by the spread of such thinking throughout the population. The psychology of the potential draft dodger is studied with the same intensity that xenobiologists bring to the analysis of alien threats. Commissars and ecclesiarchy officials maintain detailed profiles of the warning signs: excessive attachment to family members, questioning of military authority, expression of doubt about the necessity of current conflicts, any behavior that suggests the individual views themselves as more than a resource to be utilized by the state. Early intervention programs exist to identify and correct such thinking before it progresses to actual evasion attempts. Educational systems throughout the Imperium are designed to prevent the development of the mental patterns that lead to draft dodging. From earliest childhood, citizens are taught that personal desires and individual happiness are luxuries that humanity cannot afford in its struggle for survival. Love is acceptable only when it serves the greater good. Hope is permitted only when it focuses on collective rather than personal future. And fear is channeled toward humanity's enemies rather than toward service in the Emperor's name. Religious instruction reinforces these lessons with spiritual authority, teaching that the soul's highest purpose is to serve the Emperor through service to the Imperium. Those who refuse this calling are not merely traitors to their species, they are apostates who reject their own spiritual nature, damning themselves to emptiness and meaninglessness in pursuit of the illusion of self-preservation. Yet despite all these preventive measures, despite the psychological conditioning and religious indoctrination and social pressure, cowardice continues to emerge like a persistent infection in the body politic. The human spirit, it seems, retains some irreducible core of selfishness that resists even the most thorough attempts at elimination. This resistance is not cause for celebration but for grim determination, proof that the work of purification must continue, that the tools of correction must be sharpened, that the price of weakness must be made so terrible that even the most selfish soul will choose duty over self-preservation. In the end, the anatomy of cowardice reveals nothing more than the persistent delusion that individual human lives possess inherent value independent of their service to the species. This delusion is the enemy that the Imperium fights not just on distant battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of its own citizens, a war that must be won completely and permanently if humanity is to survive the darkness that surrounds it. When the whispers of refusal reach sufficient volume to disturb the perfect harmony of imperial order, the system responds with the cold precision of an immune reaction. The Arbites come first, their black armor gleaming with the authority of absolute law, their shark guns loaded not just with shot but with the weight of 10,000 years of legal precedent. Behind them march the tithe masters, pale bureaucrats whose ledgers have become weapons of mathematical destruction, and the enforcers, men and women whose humanity has been carefully calibrated to serve the needs of the state. The Arbites barracks erupts into activity as reports filter in of missing conscripts, their communications arrays crackling with encoded transmissions that coordinate the hunt across entire continents. These are not ordinary law enforcement officers. They are the Emperor's own justice made manifest, trained from childhood to view deviation from imperial law not as crime but as disease, something to be excised from the body politic with surgical precision. Their armor bears the scars of 1,000 such operations. Each mark a testament to their dedication to perfect order. Patrol squads descend into the hab blocks like antibodies responding to infection, their scanner arrays sweeping for the electromagnetic signatures that betray human presence. The technology they employ is ancient beyond measure, machine spirits that have tasted the fear of fugitives across millennia of service. These devices can detect heartbeats through meters of ferrocrete, can distinguish the particular pattern of respiration that indicates guilty knowledge, can even sense the biochemical markers of deception in human sweat and breath. The propaganda campaign begins simultaneously with the physical hunt, walls throughout the hive blooming with freshly posted bulletins that declare the truth in stark black letters: draft dodgers are heretics. The message is simple but profound, transforming what might otherwise be viewed as mere civil disobedience into a form of religious apostasy. To evade military service is not just to break the law, it is to reject the Emperor's will, to spit in the face of the divine order that keeps humanity alive in a hostile galaxy. Entire neighborhoods find themselves transformed into zones of interrogation as the enforcers establish control perimeters around suspected hiding places. Citizens are made to kneel in the streets while Arbeit squads process their identification documents, cross-referencing biometric data against vast databases of genetic information that stretch back generations. The innocent have nothing to fear, the announcements proclaim, yet somehow everyone looks guilty when viewed through the lens of absolute suspicion. The interrogation techniques employed are marvels of psychological engineering, refined through millennia of experience in extracting truth from reluctant subjects. Physical pain is only the crudest tool in the arsenal. Far more effective are the sophisticated methods that attack the bonds of family and community that motivate draft evasion in the first place. A mother suspected of hiding her son is shown detailed records of other families who attempted similar deceptions, complete with holographic recordings of their ultimate fates. Fear spreads through the population like a plague, transforming neighbors into potential informants and friends into sources of suspicion. The Arbeites exploit this paranoia with practiced efficiency, establishing reward systems that encourage citizens to report suspicious behavior in their communities. A family that consumes less food than their registered population would suggest becomes a target for investigation. A hab unit that shows unusual heat signatures triggers automated surveillance protocols. The hunt extends beyond the physical realm into the vast networks of information that bind imperial society together. Data scribes labor over cogitator terminals, analyzing patterns of resource consumption, transportation records, communication logs, any digital footprint that might reveal the location of missing conscripts. The Imperium surveillance apparatus is vast and sophisticated, a web of observation that stretches from orbital monitoring stations to the microscopic sensors embedded in everyday objects. Tithe masters arrive with their portable cogitators and their endless patience, setting up processing stations in requisitioned buildings where they can examine the paperwork of entire districts with obsessive thoroughness. These are men and women who have spent their lives reducing human complexity to manageable data sets, who can detect the subtle inconsistencies that indicate deception or evasion. They work in shifts around the clock, their pale eyes scanning documents by the light of flickering lumens as they search for the mathematical signatures of rebellion. The enforcement teams employ increasingly sophisticated methods as the hunt progresses. Genetic sampling allows them to identify family relationships with perfect accuracy, making it impossible for parents to claim ignorance of their children's whereabouts when biometric evidence proves ongoing contact. Financial records are analyzed for unusual patterns of spending that might indicate the support of hidden family members. Even waste disposal systems are monitored, their contents analyzed for clues about the actual populations of suspected households. Psychological warfare becomes a crucial component of the operation as the hunters seek to break down the networks of support that enable draft evasion. Captured associates of suspected dodgers are subjected to intensive interrogation designed not just to extract information but to demonstrate the futility of resistance. These sessions are sometimes conducted publicly, their sounds echoing through hab blocks as a reminder of the price of defiance. The religious authorities coordinate their efforts with the secular enforcers, their sermons taking on increasingly militant themes as they preach the spiritual necessity of absolute submission to imperial authority. Ecclesiarchy death cults volunteer their services as auxiliary hunters, their fanatic devotion to the emperors will making them ideal instruments for rooting out heretical thinking. These zealots move through suspected communities like living prayers, their very presence a reminder of the divine judgment that awaits the faithless. As the investigation expands, entire sectors find themselves under what amounts to martial law, their populations subjected to daily identity checks and random searches. The normal rhythms of life are disrupted as citizens learn to navigate the new reality of constant surveillance and suspicion. Markets empty as people avoid public gatherings, families stop socializing across hab units, and the basic trust that holds communities together begins to erode under the pressure of systematic paranoia. The hunters take pride in their work, viewing each captured draft dodger as a victory not just for law and order but for the future of humanity itself. They are the antibodies of imperial society, the white blood cells that protect the greater organism from the infection of individualism and self-interest. Their success is measured not just in arrests made but in the broader psychological impact of their operations, the way entire populations learn to police themselves, to internalize the surveillance state until external enforcement becomes unnecessary. The hunt for the faithless is eternal, for the disease of cowardice can never be completely cured, only contained and managed through constant vigilance and swift response. Each operation teaches new lessons about human nature and social control, adding to the vast body of knowledge that allows the Imperium to maintain order across 1 million worlds and countless billions of souls. The first examples emerge like lesions on the body politic, visible proof of what happens when the system's patience is finally exhausted. Matthias Corin had thought himself clever, hiding in the abandoned industrial sectors of sub-level Gamma 7 for 3 weeks after his conscription notice arrived. The Arbites found him huddled in a maintenance shaft, surviving on stolen rations and recycled water, his pale face gaunt with malnutrition and terror. They dragged him through the streets of Upper Hive at noon, when the maximum number of citizens would witness his passage. The branding iron bore the mark of the coward, a broken aquila with a slash through its wings, and it was heated to precisely the temperature required to scar without killing. Corin's screams echoed through the plaza as the red-hot metal pressed into his forehead, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the acrid smoke of the industrial sectors. The crowd that gathered to watch maintained absolute silence, their faces reflecting not sympathy but the careful neutrality of people who understood that the wrong expression might mark them for similar treatment. The branding was only the beginning. Corin would wear the mark for the rest of his life, however brief that might prove to be. No employer would hire him, no landlord would rent to him, no merchant would serve him without charging the special taxes levied on marked traitors. He had become a ghost in his own society, visible but untouchable, a walking reminder of the price of defiance. Within 6 months, he would be found dead in an alley, whether from starvation, violence, or despair, the records did not specify. Lydia Voss had chosen a different path, bribery rather than flight. She had offered Administratum Clerk Jorik Helm a fortune in throne gelt to remove her daughter's name from the conscription lists, believing that corruption might succeed where courage had failed. The Arbites arrested both of them in a coordinated raid that demonstrated the futility of attempting to buy exemption from imperial service. Helm was executed immediately, his body fed to the recycling systems as a message to other potentially corrupt officials. Voss received a more elaborate punishment. They took her to the Schola Progenium re-education facility on the morning of the third day, her hands bound with neural shackles that delivered precisely calibrated electrical pulses to her nervous system. The facility was a monument to the Imperium's understanding of human psychology, its sterile corridors lined with cells where the spiritually damaged could be disassembled and rebuilt according to proper specifications. Voss would spend the next 18 months learning to hate her maternal instincts, to view her love for her daughter as a form of mental illness that required constant treatment. The re-education process was thorough and methodical, beginning with sensory deprivation that lasted 72 hours and progressed through increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological reconstruction. Voss learned to recite the litanies of proper citizenship, to confess her crimes against the Emperor with genuine remorse, to beg for the privilege of demonstrating her renewed loyalty through service to the state. When she was finally released, she had become something that wore her face but spoke only in approved phrases, her personality replaced with a carefully constructed facade of imperial orthodoxy. The families of the guilty did not escape judgment. The principle of collective responsibility ensured that the shame of one member contaminated the entire bloodline, marking parents, siblings, and children as genetically suspect and morally compromised. The Corin family found their rations reduced to subsistence levels. Their work assignments changed to the most dangerous and degrading tasks available. The Voss household was relocated to Lower Hive Section 9, where the recycling systems had been malfunctioning for decades and the air itself carried the taste of industrial poison. Some punishments were designed not just to discipline the guilty but to educate the innocent. Public floggings became weekly entertainment in the main plaza, their timing carefully coordinated with shift changes to ensure maximum attendance. The victims were not just draft dodgers but anyone whose behavior had been deemed insufficiently supportive of the conscription process. Parents who had grieved too openly, siblings who had asked too many questions about military casualties, even children who had expressed reluctance to serve when their time came. The ecclesiarchy contributed its own forms of spiritual correction to the campaign against draft evasion. Heretical families were subjected to ritual purification ceremonies that could last for days, their members forced to kneel on blessed stones while priests recited the proper prayers for the cleansing of corrupted souls. These ceremonies were public affairs, attended by entire communities who learned through observation the proper relationship between individual desire and collective duty. Economic sanctions accompanied the physical and spiritual punishments, creating a comprehensive system of social exclusion that made survival increasingly difficult for the marked families. Special identification cards were issued to relatives of draft dodgers, their distinctive red borders alerting merchants, employers, and landlords to exercise appropriate caution in their dealings with the genetically compromised. These cards carried embedded data strips that tracked every transaction, every movement, every interaction with Imperial systems. The medical establishment participated enthusiastically in the punishment protocols, viewing draft evasion as a form of psychological pathology that required aggressive treatment. Families suspected of harboring dodgers were subjected to mandatory psychological evaluations designed to identify the environmental factors that had contributed to their members' criminal behavior. These sessions often involved the use of psychoactive drugs that made deception impossible, reducing proud citizens to babbling confessors who revealed every secret thought and hidden doubt. Children bore special attention in these punishment regimes, their young minds viewed as both vulnerable to corruption and capable of rehabilitation with proper intervention. Schools implemented enhanced monitoring protocols that tracked students for signs of antisocial thinking or insufficient enthusiasm for military service. Those who scored poorly on loyalty assessments were removed from their families and placed in state custody, where they could receive the intensive re-education necessary to prevent them from following in their relatives' treacherous footsteps. The documentation of each punishment was as important as the punishment itself, creating detailed records that would follow the guilty and their descendants for generations to come. These files contained not just legal proceedings but psychological profiles, genetic analyses, and behavioral predictions that would influence every aspect of the marked family's future interactions with imperial authority. A single act of draft evasion could condemn an entire bloodline to enhanced scrutiny and restricted opportunities for centuries. The marks of shame were not mere symbols but functional elements of a comprehensive social control system that turned punishment into prevention. Each branded forehead, each broken family, each destroyed life served as a constant reminder to the general population of the price of placing individual interests above collective necessity. The system had learned that the fear of punishment could be more effective than punishment itself, that the visible suffering of a few could ensure the compliance of many. The cathedral bells of Hive Mortalis ring 13 times, their bronze voices carrying across kilometers of industrial sprawl to announce the hour of spiritual instruction. In the vast nave of the Cathedral of Eternal Vigilance, 10,000 souls gather for what will be remembered as the Sermon of Absolute Duty, delivered by Cardinal Matthias Vex, whose devotion to the emperors will have been tempered in the fires of a dozen crusades and countless acts of purification. The cardinal ascends the obsidian pulpit with the measured pace of divine judgment, his scarred hands gripping the lectern as his augmetic eye sweeps across the sea of upturned faces. His congregation includes the powerful and the powerless, tithe masters and factory workers, Arbeitsenforcers and common citizens, all united in their need to understand the spiritual dimensions of the crisis that has infected their world. The air is thick with incense and expectation, the familiar comfort of ritual providing structure for truths too terrible to contemplate without divine framework. My children, Vex begins, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. We gather today in the shadow of heresy, in the presence of a corruption so fundamental that it strikes at the very heart of what it means to serve the God Emperor of mankind. Today we speak of those lost souls who refuse the call to service, who place their temporal flesh above their eternal duty, who damn themselves through the ultimate act of spiritual cowardice, the denial of their purpose. The congregation responds with practiced unison, their voices joining in the litany of submission that has echoed through imperial churches for 10 millennia. The words are carved into their hearts as surely as they are etched into the cathedral walls, a prayer so fundamental that it shapes thought itself. We are his servants, his instruments, his sacrifice. Our lives belong not to us but to him who protects us. In death, service; in service, redemption. Vex allows the echoes to fade before continuing, his augmetic eye focusing with mechanical precision on individual faces in the crowd. To refuse conscription is to refuse worship. To hide from the tithe masters is to hide from the emperor himself. These are not separate acts but aspects of the same fundamental apostasy, the belief that the individual soul might choose its own fate, that mortal flesh might possess wisdom superior to divine will. The cardinal's sermon gains momentum as he describes the spiritual architecture of imperial service, the way each soldier's death becomes a prayer offered in humanity's defense, each act of obedience a sacrament that strengthens the species' connection to its divine protector. The draft dodger, in refusing this sacred communion, does not merely shirk civic duty but commits the ultimate blasphemy, the assertion that their personal desires matter more than the Emperor's plan for human survival. Consider the mathematics of damnation, Vex proclaims, his voice rising to fill the cathedral's vast spaces. One soul that refuses service might inspire another to similar heresy. That second soul might corrupt a third, and so the spiritual infection spreads until entire communities are poisoned with the delusion that choice exists where only duty should reign. This is how civilizations die, not in glorious battle against external enemies, but through the slow rot of internal corruption. The congregation weeps as Vex describes the fate of worlds that have fallen to such spiritual decay, their populations consumed by aliens or worse because too few citizens were willing to die in humanity's defense. Holoprojectors display images of dead worlds, their surfaces scoured clean by tyrannid bioforms or twisted into impossible geometries by chaos incursions. Each image is a sermon in itself, a visual reminder of what happens when duty yields to desire. Children in the audience are given special attention as Vex explains their unique vulnerability to the heretical thinking that leads to draft evasion. Their young minds, not yet fully formed in proper doctrine, might be susceptible to the lies whispered by corrupted parents or seditious community members. The Cardinal calls upon all faithful citizens to serve as guardians of youth, to report any sign that children are being taught to value their own lives above their obligations to the species. The Emperor judges not just our actions but our intentions. Vex continues, his scarred hands gesturing toward the towering statue of the God Emperor that dominates the cathedral's apse. He sees into the hearts of those who serve reluctantly, who obey from fear rather than love, who secretly harbor the same selfish desires as the draft dodgers even as they fulfill their surface obligations. Mere compliance is not enough. The soul must be purified of all attachment to the illusion of individual importance. The sermon reaches its climax as Vex calls for a ritual of collective confession, asking the congregation to acknowledge their own spiritual shortcomings and beg forgiveness for the moments of weakness that make them susceptible to heretical thinking. 10,000 voices join in admitting their sins: the mother who loves her son more than the emperor, the father who questions the necessity of endless war, the child who fears death more than Dishna. Each confession is a small spiritual surgery, removing another fragment of the selfishness that threatens to corrupt imperial society. Better to die nameless on some alien soil, Vex declares, his words echoing with the finality of divine judgment, than to live branded a coward in the Emperor's sight. Better to fall in glorious service than to survive in shameful hiding. Better to offer one's life as a willing sacrifice than to hoard it like a miser hoards coins, for in the end, all flesh returns to dust, but the soul that serves faithfully earns eternal glory. The congregation responds with the oath of absolute fidelity, their combined voices creating a wall of sound that seems to make the cathedral itself tremble with divine approval. Parents look upon their children with renewed understanding of their duty, seeing not beloved offspring but resources temporarily entrusted to their care until the Emperor requires their return. Children gaze upon their parents with gratitude for the lesson in proper thinking, understanding for the first time that love means preparing oneself for sacrifice. As the ceremony concludes, Vex offers a final prayer for the souls of the draft dodgers, asking the Emperor to show mercy to those who have been led astray by weakness and ignorance. Yet his words make clear that mercy, in imperial terms, means not forgiveness but efficient punishment, the swift correction of error that prevents further spiritual contamination. The congregation files out in perfect silence, their faces reflecting the solemn joy that comes from understanding one's place in the divine order. Better to die nameless on some alien soil, Vex declares, his words echoing with the finality of divine judgment, than to live branded a coward in the Emperor's sight. Better to fall in glorious service than to survive in shameful hiding. Better to offer one's life as a willing sacrifice than to hoard it like a miser hoards coins, for in the end, all flesh returns to dust, but the soul that serves faithfully earns eternal glory. The congregation responds with the oath of absolute fidelity, their combined voices creating a wall of sound that seems to make the cathedral itself tremble with divine approval. Parents look upon their children with renewed understanding of their duty, seeing not beloved offspring but resources temporarily entrusted to their care until the Emperor requires their return. Children gaze upon their parents with gratitude for the lesson in proper thinking, understanding for the first time that love means preparing oneself for sacrifice. As the ceremony concludes, Vex offers a final prayer for the souls of the draft dodgers, asking the Emperor to show mercy to those who have been led astray by weakness and ignorance. Yet his words make clear that mercy, in imperial terms, means not forgiveness but efficient punishment, the swift correction of error that prevents further spiritual contamination. The congregation files out in perfect silence, their faces reflecting the solemn joy that comes from understanding one's place in the divine order. Economic warfare becomes a crucial component of the escalated enforcement campaign as the authorities implement systems designed to track resource consumption with mathematical precision. Families that purchase too much food are suspected of supporting hidden members. Households that consume too little power are investigated for signs of abandonment. Even waste production is monitored for patterns that might indicate the presence of unregistered individuals. The entire economy becomes a surveillance system, every transaction a potential clue in the hunt for the missing. Public executions increase in frequency and spectacle as the authorities seek to demonstrate the futility of resistance through increasingly elaborate displays of state power. The executions are carefully choreographed events that combine punishment with entertainment, their timing coordinated with work schedules to ensure maximum attendance. The methods employed are chosen not for efficiency but for educational value, each death serving as a detailed lesson in the consequences of defying imperial authority. The search operations extend into previously unthinkable locations as desperation drives the hunters to ever more extreme measures. Sacred sites are violated, diplomatic facilities searched, even the private chambers of high-ranking officials subjected to scrutiny as the paranoia reaches into every level of society. The investigation develops its own momentum, consuming resources and personnel at an exponential rate as each new lead generates dozens of additional suspects requiring processing. Medical facilities become fronts in the war against draft evasion as doctors and surgeons are conscripted to identify signs of deliberate injury or alteration designed to avoid military service. Hospitals implement mandatory reporting systems that flag patients seeking treatment for conditions that might be self-inflicted, while medical records are cross-referenced against conscription databases to identify suspicious patterns of illness or injury among draft-eligible populations. The technological infrastructure of the Hive is weaponized in service of the search, with traffic control systems reprogrammed to track individual movements, water treatment facilities modified to analyze biochemical markers in waste streams, even air recycling systems fitted with sensors capable of detecting the unique pheromone signatures that indicate human presence. The entire environment becomes an extension of the enforcement apparatus, transforming the act of simply existing into a form of submission to state surveillance. Children become unwitting agents of the security state as educational programs are modified to emphasize the importance of reporting suspicious behavior among family members and community associates. Schools implement reward systems that encourage students to inform on their parents, while psychological evaluation protocols are designed to identify young people who might be susceptible to heretical influences. The innocence of childhood is transformed into a weapon against the privacy that enables draft evasion. The escalation feeds on itself, each new security measure creating additional complications that require further intervention. The resources devoted to hunting draft dodgers begin to exceed the military value of the missing personnel, but the symbolic importance of maintaining perfect compliance prevents any consideration of reducing the enforcement effort. The hunt has become more important than its original purpose, a ritual of state power that must be completed regardless of cost. In the processing centers buried deep beneath the Hive's industrial core, the true architecture of imperial justice reveals itself in all its terrible precision. Here, those foolish enough to believe they could escape their obligations to the Emperor discover that their capture marks not the end of their story but its transformation into something far worse than the military service they sought to avoid. The facilities hum with the mechanical rhythm of human disassembly, each captured draft dodger sorted, catalogued, and processed according to protocols refined through millennia of experience in the efficient disposal of problematic souls. Marcus Thorne had hidden in the Underhive for 47 days, surviving on stolen rations and recycled water while his family mourned him as dead rather than admit his cowardice. When the Arbites finally cornered him in a maintenance tunnel 3 kilometers below street level, he wept with relief, believing that his ordeal was finally over. He could not have imagined that his real suffering had not yet begun. The processing technicians strip him of his identity with the same clinical efficiency they used to strip him of his clothing, his name replaced with a numerical designation that will follow him through the bureaucratic machinery of punishment. Thorn is destined for penal legion service, his file marked with the scarlet notation that identifies him as expendable human material suitable only for suicide missions and desperate last stands. The penal legions are where the Imperium sends its human garbage, criminals, cowards, and heretics who retain just enough value to be used as ammunition in the galaxy's endless wars. He will be shipped to a military staging area where his personality will be systematically destroyed through chemical reconditioning and psychological surgery, leaving behind an automaton capable of following orders but incapable of independent thought. The surgical suite where they prepare him for service gleams with antiseptic sterility, its walls lined with cogitator screens that monitor every aspect of the transformation process. Tech adepts move through the chamber like mechanical spiders, their servo skulls hovering overhead as they calibrate the instruments that will remake Thorn into something useful to the war machine. The procedure begins with memory suppression, chemical agents that dissolve the neural pathways associated with personal identity while leaving intact the basic motor functions and language skills necessary for military service. Elena Vasquez had attempted bribery rather than flight, believing that corruption might succeed where courage had failed. Her fate is different but no less terrible. Transformation into a servitor, her flesh and bone reformed into a living machine capable of performing the menial tasks that keep Imperial civilization functioning. The biomechanical integration process requires delicate surgery as tech priests replace her organs with mechanical analogs, her nervous system rewired to accept direct digital input from command cogitators. The servitor conversion facility operates with the precision of a sacred ritual, each step in the transformation process accompanied by hymns of dedication to the Omnicia. Vasquez's consciousness is not destroyed but caged, trapped within a body that no longer responds to her will but serves instead as a vehicle for machine intelligence. She will spend the remainder of her existence performing repetitive tasks with perfect efficiency, her human awareness slowly dissolving as the mechanical components of her brain gradually replace the biological ones. Some draft dodgers are processed through the corpse starch facilities, their organic matter recycled into the protein paste that feeds the Hive's teeming billions. This fate is reserved for those whose crimes are considered especially heinous. Repeat offenders whose multiple attempts at evasion mark them as incorrigibly corrupted by selfish thinking. The recycling process is presented as a form of redemption, a final opportunity to serve the Emperor by nourishing his faithful servants, but the reality is simply the efficient disposal of problematic biological material. The execution chambers represent the most merciful fate available to captured draft dodgers, though mercy in imperial terms bears little resemblance to conventional understanding of the concept. Public executions serve multiple purposes: punishment of the guilty, education of the innocent, and entertainment for the masses who gather to witness the state's power over individual life and death. The methods employed are chosen for their symbolic value rather than their efficiency, each death serving as a carefully crafted message about the consequences of defying imperial authority. Medical experimentation provides another avenue for extracting value from the bodies of the condemned, their flesh serving as raw material for research into combat pharmaceuticals and battlefield surgical techniques. The Imperial Guard's Medical Corps maintains close relationships with the processing facilities, their requests for test subjects fulfilled with bureaucratic efficiency. Draft dodgers volunteer for these programs not from altruism but from the understanding that any death is preferable to servitor conversion or penal legion service. The psychological processing centers focus on cases where rehabilitation might be possible. Their techniques designed to identify and correct the mental abnormalities that lead to draft evasion. The treatment programs combine pharmaceutical intervention with intensive behavioral modification, their goal not healing but the creation of model imperial citizens whose compliance has been rendered absolute through scientific precision. Successful graduates of these programs often become the most enthusiastic enforcers of conscription policies, their converted zeal serving as both proof of the system's effectiveness and insurance against future backsliding. Children of draft dodgers receive special processing designed to prevent the transmission of heretical thinking across generational lines. The facilities maintain specialized wards where young minds are subjected to intensive re-education protocols that replace family loyalty with devotion to the state. These children often prove to be among the Imperium's most effective agents, their childhood trauma transformed into fanatical dedication to preventing others from experiencing similar corruption. The documentation process is as important as the physical processing, creating detailed records that track every aspect of each case from initial capture through final disposition. These files serve multiple purposes: legal evidence of proper procedures, research data for improving future operations, and psychological weapons for discouraging potential draft dodgers who might otherwise believe their cases would be handled with individual consideration. The bureaucracy of punishment is itself a form of torture, reducing human beings to statistical abstractions that can be manipulated without emotional investment. Quality control systems ensure that no processing errors compromise the efficiency of the punishment apparatus, their protocols designed to prevent the waste of valuable human resources through premature death or inadequate conditioning. The facilities operate according to strict quotas that balance the need for exemplary punishment against the practical requirements of maintaining sufficient inventory for various processing streams. Even in death and transformation, the draft dodgers serve the statistical needs of the system they attempted to escape. The processing facilities operate in shifts around the clock, their machinery never silent as new captures arrive and processed materials are shipped to their final destinations. The workers who staff these facilities are themselves products of the system, their humanity carefully calibrated to perform their duties without excessive emotional involvement. They view each case not as a person but as a problem to be solved, their professional satisfaction derived from the efficient operation of the machinery rather than from any consideration of individual human worth. The Great Wheel of Imperial Justice completes another evolution as fresh tithe quotas arrive through the astropathic networks, their psychic transmission carrying the weight of divine mandate across the void between stars. Before the processing centers have finished disposing of the previous wave of draft dodgers, new names are already being inscribed in the ledgers of obligation, new families learning that their children belong not to them but to the Emperor's endless appetite for human sacrifice. The cycle repeats with mechanical precision, each iteration refined by the lessons learned from the previous one. The bureaucrats who manage the conscription process have become students of human nature, their understanding of resistance patterns growing more sophisticated with each generation of enforcement operations. They know now which psychological pressures are most effective at preventing evasion attempts, which punishments create the optimal balance between deterrence and resource utilization, which surveillance methods produce the highest yield of useful intelligence. New technologies emerge from the Imperial War Machines research divisions, their applications extending far beyond the battlefield into the realm of domestic population control. Scanner arrays become more sensitive, capable of detecting human presence through ever greater barriers of ferrocrete and steel. Psychological conditioning techniques grow more efficient, reducing the time and resources required to transform rebellious citizens into compliant servants of the state. The machinery of oppression evolves with each iteration, becoming more perfect in its terrible purpose. The lessons carved into the collective consciousness of the population through previous enforcement operations serve as a foundation for new layers of control. Parents who witnessed the public executions of draft dodgers raise their children with an enhanced understanding of the futility of resistance. Communities that survive the intensive investigations of previous cycles develop internal mechanisms of surveillance and reporting that reduce the need for external intervention. The system teaches the population to police itself, transforming every citizen into an agent of imperial authority. Yet despite the brutal efficiency of the punishment apparatus, despite the psychological conditioning and technological surveillance, new draft dodgers emerge like persistent infections in the body politic. The human spirit, it seems, retains some irreducible core of selfishness that resists even the most comprehensive attempts at elimination. Each new generation produces its quota of individuals who believe themselves capable of escaping their obligations, who imagine that their personal desires might somehow outweigh the collective needs of the species. These new resistors learn from the mistakes of their predecessors, developing more sophisticated methods of evasion that force corresponding advances in enforcement techniques. The underground networks become more secure, their communication protocols more carefully designed to avoid detection by Imperial surveillance systems. Hiding places are chosen with greater attention to the scanner technologies employed by the Arbites. The methods of obtaining false documentation grow more refined, exploiting weaknesses in bureaucratic processes that previous investigations revealed. The system responds to these innovations with its own adaptations, the eternal dance between oppressor and oppressed driving continuous improvement in the machinery of social control. New surveillance technologies are deployed to counter advanced evasion techniques, while psychological warfare campaigns are refined to address the specific mental vulnerabilities discovered in captured resistors. The enforcement apparatus grows more sophisticated with each iteration, learning to anticipate and counter resistance before it can fully develop. The economic dimensions of the cycle become increasingly important as the costs of enforcement operations consume ever larger portions of planetary resources. The hunt for draft dodgers requires massive investments in personnel, technology, and infrastructure that must be balanced against the practical value of the recovered conscripts. Yet the symbolic importance of maintaining perfect compliance prevents any consideration of reducing enforcement efforts. The political cost of acknowledging limits to imperial authority considered unacceptable regardless of economic factors. Religious authorities adapt their doctrines to address the theological challenges posed by persistent draft evasion, their sermons evolving to incorporate new understanding of the spiritual diseases that motivate resistance to imperial authority. The ecclesiarchy develops specialized ministries focused on the prevention and cure of draft-dodging behavior, their techniques combining traditional religious instruction with advanced psychological manipulation to create more effective tools for spiritual control. The processing facilities expand their capabilities to handle increasing volumes of captured resistors, their operations becoming more efficient as staff gain experience in the various forms of human disposal and transformation. New techniques for extracting value from problematic citizens are developed through experimentation on previous captures, while quality control systems are refined to ensure optimal resource utilization. The machinery of punishment becomes more perfect with each generation, approaching the theoretical ideal of complete efficiency in the conversion of human problems into useful materials. Educational systems throughout the Imperium incorporate lessons learned from each cycle of resistance and suppression, their curricula modified to address the specific psychological vulnerabilities that lead to draft evasion. Children are taught not just obedience but the proper forms of thinking that make obedience natural and inevitable. The goal is not mere compliance but the elimination of the mental processes that generate resistance, the creation of human beings incapable of conceiving alternatives to submission. The data collected from each enforcement operation feeds into vast analytical engines that map the social, psychological, and economic factors contributing to draft evasion across multiple worlds and sectors. This information is used to develop predictive models that can identify potential resistors before they act, allowing for preemptive intervention that prevents the development of organized resistance networks. The system learns to see into the future, anticipating rebellion before it occurs and strangling it in its cradle. The cycle has become self-sustaining, its momentum carrying it forward regardless of the intentions of any individual participant. The bureaucrats who manage it, the enforcers who implement it, and the citizens who suffer under it are all trapped within its logic, their actions predetermined by the mathematical imperatives of imperial survival. The system feeds on its own operations, growing stronger and more perfect with each iteration as it approaches the ultimate goal of absolute control over human behavior and thought. The decision comes down through channels so secure that even the astropaths who carry it are mind-wiped afterward, their consciousness scrubbed clean of any memory that might contaminate the operational security of what is about to unfold. Sector Command has concluded that Hive Mortalis Prime has become irredeemably corrupted by the cancer of draft evasion, its population so thoroughly infected with the disease of individual will that only the most drastic surgical intervention can prevent the spread of heretical thinking to neighboring worlds. The accusation is comprehensive and devastating. An entire hive harboring draft dodgers, its administrative systems compromised by corruption, its citizens complicit in systematic resistance to imperial authority. The evidence is circumstantial but overwhelming. Too many missing conscripts, too many administrative irregularities, too many reports of suspicious behavior from loyalist informants scattered throughout the population. The mathematical models employed by Sector Command indicate a probability of systematic resistance that exceeds acceptable thresholds for containment through conventional enforcement measures.